September 11th, 2012. The date itself should have been a warning. 12 hours of chaos. 4 Americans dead, including a U.S. ambassador. A diplomatic compound in flames. And a question that still haunts the intelligence community. How did we not see this coming? The warnings were there. The intelligence existed. Local sources had information. But somewhere between the streets of Benghazi and the decision-makers in Washington, everything broke down. This is the story of how one of America's most sophisticated intelligence operations failed catastrophically. Not because they didn't have information, but because they couldn't interpret it, couldn't communicate it, and couldn't act on it fast enough. This is about the gap between knowing something might happen and stopping it from happening. And that gap cost lives. The smoke was still rising from the burning compound when the question started. How did heavily armed militants coordinate an attack on American facilities without triggering alarms? Where was the security? Where was the backup? Where was the CIA? The answers, when they finally emerged, revealed something more troubling than a simple security failure. They revealed a system that was drowning in information but starving for understanding. A bureaucracy so tangled that warnings got lost in the maze. An intelligence apparatus that saw the pieces but couldn't assemble the puzzle until it was too late. Benghazi wasn't just a tragedy. It was a failure of everything intelligence agencies are supposed to prevent. Let's start with what they knew. Because the idea that Benghazi came out of nowhere, that it was a complete surprise, that's just not true. The intelligence community had been watching Libya deteriorate for months. They knew extremist groups were operating in Benghazi. They knew weapons were flooding into the city after Gaddafi's fall. They knew anti-American sentiment was growing. They had reports, they had sources, they had data. What they didn't have was a system that could turn all that noise into a clear signal that said, "Evacuate now, or people will die." In the year leading up to the attack, there were dozens of security incidents in Benghazi. Attacks on international organizations, bombings of diplomatic facilities, assassinations of security officials. The British closed their consulate after an attack on their ambassador's convoy. The Red Cross pulled out after multiple incidents. Everyone was leaving Benghazi because it was becoming a war zone. Everyone except the Americans, who stayed despite the mounting evidence that staying was dangerous. CIA analysts had been tracking the growth of militant groups in eastern Libya. Ansar al-Sharia, a group with ties to Al-Qaeda, was operating openly in Benghazi. They weren't hiding. They were holding rallies, recruiting, building support among local militias. Intelligence reports documented their activities, their capabilities, their anti-American rhetoric. These weren't rumors or vague threats. This was specific, detailed intelligence about organized groups with the means and motivation to attack American targets. Local informants, Libyans working with the CIA, were reporting increasing chatter about potential attacks. Nothing specific about dates or targets, but a growing sense that something was being planned. The kind of atmosphere that experienced intelligence officers recognize as pre-operational activity. When extremist groups start talking more carefully, when known militants suddenly go quiet or change their patterns, when weapons start moving, these are indicators that professionals are trained to recognize. But here's where the system started failing. That information existed in fragments scattered across different agencies, different analysts, different classification systems. The CIA had some pieces. The State Department had others. Military intelligence had more. Nobody had the complete picture because nobody was effectively sharing information or synthesizing it into actionable intelligence. Each agency was looking at its own slice of the situation and missing the larger pattern. There's also the volume problem. Intelligence agencies in 2012 were drowning in information from around the world. Analysts were tracking threats in Afghanistan, Pakistan, Yemen, Somalia, Syria, Iraq, and dozens of other locations. Libya was one concern among hundreds. Benghazi was one city among thousands being monitored. The warnings about Libya were competing for attention with warnings about everywhere else. And in that competition, Benghazi didn't rise to the level of immediate crisis until it was. The threat assessment process itself was flawed. Different analysts were reaching different conclusions about the same information. Some believed Benghazi was becoming too dangerous for American personnel. Others thought the risk was manageable with appropriate security measures. There was no clear process for escalating dissenting views or forcing a decision when analysts disagreed. So the intelligence reports went up the chain with hedged language and multiple interpretations, leaving decision-makers without clear guidance. Ambassador Chris Stevens knew Benghazi was dangerous. His own cables back to Washington documented security concerns, requested additional protection, and warned about the deteriorating situation. These weren't casual observations. They were official requests from the senior American diplomat in Libya saying, "We need more security, or we need to leave." Those cables were received, filed, and largely ignored. The security situation at the diplomatic compound was inadequate by almost any standard. The facility wasn't a proper embassy. It was a temporary mission in a converted residential compound. The perimeter security was minimal. The defensive positions were insufficient. The safe room, where Stevens would eventually die from smoke inhalation, wasn't properly secured or ventilated. The entire setup was designed for a permissive environment, not a war zone. But Benghazi wasn't permissive anymore. Requests for additional security personnel had been made repeatedly. Military security teams that had been in Libya were scheduled to leave, and requests to extend their deployment or replace them with equivalent protection were denied. The official explanation was budget constraints and the assessment that local security forces could provide adequate protection. That assessment proved catastrophically wrong. The local militia providing security for the compound was of questionable reliability. Some members had suspected ties to extremist groups. Their loyalty was uncertain. Their capability was limited. And their willingness to actually defend the compound against a determined attack was never tested until the night they fled or joined the attackers. Relying on them was a calculated risk that turned into a fatal mistake. The CIA had a separate facility nearby, an annex that housed CIA personnel conducting intelligence operations. This facility was better secured and better defended than the diplomatic compound. But its existence was classified, which meant security planning for the two facilities wasn't properly coordinated. The State Department couldn't fully integrate CIA security resources into their planning, because they weren't supposed to know all the details of what the CIA was doing. This separation, maintained for operational security reasons, created gaps that would prove deadly. There was also a fundamental misunderstanding about the nature of the threat. Security planning seemed to focus on the kind of threats embassies typically face: small-scale attacks, individual extremists, protests that might turn violent. What they weren't prepared for was a coordinated military-style assault by dozens of trained fighters with heavy weapons, mortars, and tactical coordination. The security measures in place were completely inadequate for that level of threat. The attack began around 9:40 p.m. local time. Armed militants approached the diplomatic compound in multiple groups. They weren't protesters who spontaneously turned violent. They were organized fighters executing a planned assault. They had weapons, they had explosives, they knew the compound's layout, and they knew there wasn't enough security to stop them. The initial assault overwhelmed the small security force within minutes. The attackers breached the perimeter, entered the compound, and set buildings on fire using diesel fuel. Ambassador Stevens, Foreign Service Officer Sean Smith, and other personnel retreated to a safe room. But the safe room, while secure against intrusion, wasn't protected against fire and smoke. Stevens and Smith died from smoke inhalation while hiding in what was supposed to be the safest location in the compound. Security personnel from the CIA annex, about a mile away, heard the attack and prepared to respond. But they faced a critical decision: leave immediately and possibly arrive too late, or wait for intelligence about what they were facing and risk delaying too long. Initial reports from the compound were confused and incomplete. Nobody knew exactly how many attackers there were, what weapons they had, or whether this was the main attack or a diversion for an assault on the CIA facility. The CIA security team eventually moved toward the diplomatic compound, arriving to find it overrun and on fire. They managed to evacuate some personnel, but couldn't locate Ambassador Stevens in the smoke and chaos. They came under fire during the evacuation and had to withdraw back to the CIA annex. Stevens's body would later be found by Libyans and taken to a hospital, but by then, he was already dead. Back at the CIA annex, the security team prepared for what they correctly anticipated would be a follow-up attack. The militants knew about the CIA facility. Its location wasn't as secret as the agency had believed. Around midnight, the annex came under assault. Mortar fire, small arms, coordinated attacks from multiple directions. The defenders fought back, but they were outnumbered and outgunned. The mortar attack was particularly devastating. Militants fired with surprising accuracy, suggesting they had either pre-registered the target or had trained personnel directing the fire. Mortar rounds hit the annex buildings, killing CIA contractors Tyrone Woods and Glenn Doherty, and wounding others. The accuracy and coordination of the mortar attack indicated this wasn't an improvised assault. It was a planned military operation. Throughout the night, calls for support went out. But support from where? The nearest substantial US military assets were hours away. Air support couldn't be scrambled fast enough. Special operations forces were too far away to intervene in time. The personnel in Benghazi were fighting alone, and everyone knew it. The cavalry wasn't coming because the cavalry couldn't get there fast enough. While the attack was happening, Washington was trying to understand what was going on. But the information reaching decision-makers was incomplete, delayed, and often contradictory. Initial reports suggested the attack might have begun as a protest over an anti-Islamic video that had sparked demonstrations in Cairo earlier that day. This misperception, that Benghazi started as a protest that turned violent, shaped the initial response and delayed recognition that this was a planned terrorist attack. The confusion stemmed partly from the fog of war, the difficulty of getting accurate information from a chaotic situation in real time. But it also reflected deeper problems in how information flowed through the system. Field reports had to go through multiple layers of analysis and interpretation before reaching decision-makers. Each layer added delay and potentially altered the message. By the time information reached the people who could authorize action, it was already outdated or distorted. There were also bureaucratic barriers between agencies. The CIA had personnel on the ground and intelligence about what was happening, but they couldn't necessarily share all of it with the State Department. Because of classification restrictions, the military had assets that might have helped but needed clear authorization to enter Libyan airspace or conduct operations. The State Department had responsibility for diplomatic security but limited capability to respond to a military-scale attack. Nobody had clear authority to override bureaucratic procedures and just act. The interagency coordination that's supposed to happen during crises was hampered by unclear chains of command and confusion about who had authority to make critical decisions. Should the military send assets toward Libya on their own initiative or wait for authorization? Should the CIA personnel at the annex move toward the diplomatic compound immediately or wait for orders? Should evacuation aircraft be launched before knowing whether there would be secure landing zones? Each of these decisions involved risk, and the system wasn't designed to make rapid decisions under pressure. Communication with the personnel under attack was also problematic. Phone lines were unreliable. Internet connectivity was limited. The defenders were fighting for their lives and didn't have time to provide detailed situation reports. Washington was making decisions based on fragmentary information that was minutes or hours old. It was like trying to conduct a military operation through a series of delayed, incomplete text messages. After the attack, investigations revealed that intelligence about potential threats had existed but hadn't been effectively used. Some of this was classic intelligence failure, having information but not recognizing its significance. Some was structural, having information in one part of the bureaucracy that wasn't shared with other parts. And some was human, analysts and decision makers making judgments that in hindsight were clearly wrong. The CIA had been tracking extremist activity in Benghazi for months. They knew about Ansar al-Sharia. They knew about weapons proliferation. They knew about increasing anti-American sentiment. But that knowledge didn't translate into a clear warning that an attack was imminent. Partly because imminent is difficult to define. Threats can be persistent without becoming immediate. Analysts are trained to avoid crying wolf, to not raise alarms unless they have specific, actionable intelligence. The standard for warning about an attack is high, and the Benghazi intelligence didn't meet that standard until after the attack happened. Local informants had provided information about potential threats, but their warnings were often non-specific. Something might happen, doesn't tell you when, where, or how to prepare. Intelligence agencies receive thousands of these kinds of general warnings. If they responded to every vague threat with maximum security measures, they'd never be able to operate. So there's a constant judgment call about which threats are credible and immediate versus which are background noise. In Benghazi, that judgment was wrong. There were also indicators that should have been recognized as significant, but weren't. Surveillance of the diplomatic compound by unknown individuals had been reported. Patterns of extremist activity had shifted in ways that, with hindsight, looked like pre-operational planning. Small incidents, a breach of the compound perimeter weeks earlier, suspicious vehicles near the facility, individually seemed minor but collectively suggested increasing targeting of American facilities. These indicators existed in various intelligence reports but weren't synthesized into a coherent threat picture. The analytical process itself had problems. Different analysts looking at the same information were reaching different conclusions about threat levels. Some were more alarmed than others, but there wasn't an effective mechanism for resolving these analytical disagreements or escalating minority views. The intelligence that reached decision makers was often hedged, qualified, and ambiguous, which is appropriate for uncertainty, but not helpful for making security decisions. When the attack began, military assets started moving toward Libya. Special operations forces were alerted. Aircraft were prepared for potential rescue or evacuation missions. But everything takes time. Forces need to be briefed, equipped, and transported. Aircraft need to be fueled and armed. Permissions need to be obtained for entering foreign airspace. Even moving at maximum speed, the nearest substantial military capability was hours away from Benghazi. There's been controversy about whether more could have been done, whether forces could have arrived faster, whether the military response was adequate. The reality is complex. Some assets could theoretically have arrived earlier, but without clear information about what they'd be facing, sending them into an active combat situation without proper preparation could have resulted in more casualties. Other assets simply couldn't have arrived in time regardless of decisions made. They were too far away, and the attack was over too quickly. The debate over stand-down orders, whether CIA security personnel were told to delay their response, has been particularly contentious. Some personnel reported being told to wait rather than immediately rushing toward the diplomatic compound. CIA leadership denies giving such orders. The truth seems to be that there was confusion and delay in the initial response, some of which was necessary to assess the situation, and some of which in hindsight was clearly too cautious. But attributing this to a single deliberate stand-down order oversimplifies what was actually a chaotic situation with unclear information and difficult decisions. What's clear is that the personnel in Benghazi fought bravely with the resources available. They defended the CIA annex for hours against superior numbers. They attempted to rescue personnel from the diplomatic compound despite heavy fire. They called for support and did everything they could to survive until help arrived. The failure wasn't in their actions. It was in the system that put them in an untenable situation without adequate security or rapid response capability. The Benghazi attack immediately became politically controversial in ways that complicated understanding what actually happened. The Obama administration's initial characterization of the attack as stemming from a protest rather than a planned terrorist operation became a major political issue. Republicans accused the administration of deliberately misleading the public to protect the president's counterterrorism credentials before an election. Democrats defended the administration's actions and accused Republicans of politicizing a tragedy. The truth, as usual, was more complicated than either partisan narrative. The initial reports really did suggest the attack might have been related to protests over the anti-Islamic video. That assessment was wrong, but it wasn't necessarily deliberately false. It was based on incomplete information and assumptions that in hindsight were clearly incorrect. The administration should have corrected the record faster when better information became available. But the delay seems more attributable to bureaucratic caution than deliberate deception. The political controversy made it harder to conduct objective analysis of what went wrong. Every finding became fodder for partisan warfare. Congressional investigations multiplied, with different committees pursuing different agendas. Some were genuinely trying to understand failures and prevent future attacks. Others were clearly more interested in political damage than in learning lessons. The result was years of hearings, reports, and accusations that generated more heat than light Hillary Clinton, who was Secretary of State during the attack, became a particular target of criticism. Her famous, "What difference does it make?" response during a congressional hearing was taken out of context and used to suggest she was dismissing the deaths of Americans. In context, she was arguing that determining whether the attack stemmed from a protest or was planned terrorism, while important for understanding what happened, didn't change the fact that Americans had died and that security improvements were needed. But in the political environment, nuance was lost. The politicization damaged the intelligence community's ability to learn from the failure. When every finding is scrutinized for political implications, when analysts have to worry that their assessments will be used as political weapons, it becomes harder to conduct honest analysis. Some lessons from Benghazi were learned and applied, but others were probably obscured by the need to defend institutional reputations and avoid political embarrassment. Strip away the politics and conspiracy theories, and several clear failures emerge. First, threat assessment failed. The intelligence community had information suggesting Benghazi was becoming dangerous, but didn't translate that into adequate security measures or evacuation recommendations. The assessment that local security could protect American personnel proved catastrophically wrong. Second, interagency coordination failed. The CIA, State Department, and military all had relevant information and capabilities, but they didn't effectively share information or coordinate responses. Bureaucratic boundaries and unclear chains of command delayed action and created confusion about who had authority to make critical decisions. Third, security planning failed. The diplomatic compound wasn't adequately protected for the threat environment. Requests for additional security were denied or delayed. The facility design itself was vulnerable to the kind of attack that eventually occurred. And contingency planning for how to respond if an attack happened was clearly inadequate. Fourth, rapid response capability didn't exist. When the attack happened, there were no substantial US military forces positioned to respond quickly. The nearest assets were hours away. This wasn't necessarily anyone's fault. You can't position military forces for rapid response to every diplomatic facility in the world, but it meant that when the attack happened, the people in Benghazi were largely on their own. Fifth, communication systems failed under pressure. Information from the field wasn't reaching decision-makers quickly or accurately. Decision-makers' questions and orders weren't reaching field personnel effectively. The communication infrastructure that worked fine in peacetime couldn't handle the demands of a real-time crisis. Sixth, analytical processes failed to distinguish signal from noise. The intelligence about threats in Benghazi existed, but was buried in vast amounts of other intelligence from around the world. Analysts didn't or couldn't prioritize Benghazi as requiring immediate action. In the aftermath of Benghazi, various agencies conducted reviews and implemented changes. The State Department revised security procedures at diplomatic facilities in high-threat environments. The CIA adjusted how it coordinates security with other agencies. The military pre-positioned assets for faster response to crises at diplomatic facilities. Intelligence analytical processes were supposedly improved to better identify and escalate threats. But whether these changes went far enough is debatable. Some critics argue that the fundamental problems, bureaucratic barriers, risk-averse decision-making, inadequate resources for security, remain largely unchanged. Others contend that the lessons have been learned and applied, and that facilities are now better protected and better able to respond to threats. One clear lesson is that temporary facilities in high-threat environments require security comparable to permanent embassies. The idea that you can maintain an American diplomatic presence in a war zone with minimal security because the facility is temporary or low profile proved false. If you're going to be there, you need real security regardless of the facility's official designation. Another lesson is that intelligence needs to be not just collected, but synthesized and acted upon. Having information scattered across different agencies and databases doesn't help if nobody's putting it together into a coherent picture. The intelligence community needs better systems for information sharing and collaborative analysis, especially regarding threats to American personnel abroad. A third lesson is that rapid response capability matters. You can't always prevent attacks, but you can potentially limit their impact if you can respond quickly with overwhelming force. The fact that substantial military assets were hours away from Benghazi meant the people there had to fight alone until the attack was over. Pre-positioning quick reaction forces, maintaining alert aircraft, and having pre-planned response options could save lives in future crises. A fourth lesson is that threat assessments need to err on the side of caution when American lives are at risk. The cost of over-responding to a threat that doesn't materialize is measured in money and inconvenience. The cost of under-responding to a threat that does materialize is measured in lives. When in doubt, assume the worst and prepare accordingly. Behind all the politics, investigations, and bureaucratic failures were 4 Americans who died: Ambassador Chris Stevens, Foreign Service Officer Sean Smith, and former Navy SEALs Tyrone Woods and Glenn Doherty. They were in Benghazi doing difficult, dangerous work in service of their country. They died because the systems meant to protect them. Failed Ambassador Stevens was a career diplomat who had dedicated his life to understanding and engaging with the Middle East. He'd served in Libya before, during the revolution that overthrew Gaddafi, and believed in the importance of American engagement with the new Libya. He went to Benghazi despite the dangers because he believed his presence mattered. He was right about that, but he paid for it with his life. Sean Smith was an information management officer, one of the unsung professionals who keep diplomatic facilities functioning. He had a wife and children. He was doing his job, supporting the mission, when he died of smoke inhalation in that safe room that turned out to be a death trap. Tyrone Woods and Glenn Doherty were contractors working security for the CIA. Both were former Special Operations personnel, skilled, experienced, capable. They fought for hours defending the CIA annex, holding off attackers, protecting their colleagues. They died when mortar rounds hit their position. They died doing exactly what they were trained to do, protecting others. These men had families who loved them, who waited for them to come home, who had to be told that they were never coming back. Their deaths weren't abstractions or political talking points. They were tragedies that shattered lives and left permanent scars on the people who loved them. One of the most overlooked aspects of the Benghazi story is the CIA annex itself, what it was doing there, why its existence complicated the security situation, and how its classified status may have contributed to the failures that night. This wasn't just a listening post or a small intelligence office. It was a significant CIA operation conducting sensitive activities in one of the most unstable regions in Libya. The annex was located about a mile from the diplomatic compound, in a facility that was far better secured and defended. It housed CIA personnel conducting intelligence operations related to several objectives: tracking extremist groups operating in Libya, monitoring weapons proliferation after Gaddafi's fall, and reportedly involved in efforts to recover dangerous weapons, including surface-to-air missiles, that had disappeared from Libyan military stockpiles during the revolution. The weapons issue was particularly sensitive. Gaddafi's regime had accumulated significant arsenals of advanced weapons, including man-portable air defense systems that could shoot down commercial aircraft. When the regime fell, these weapons scattered. Some were secured, many weren't. The CIA was working with Libyan militias and other partners to track and recover these weapons before they could be smuggled to terrorist groups or used in attacks. This was critical work, but it was also covert and potentially controversial if it became public. There were also reports, never fully confirmed but persistent, that the CIA was involved in facilitating weapons transfers to Syrian rebels fighting the Assad regime. The theory was that weapons recovered from Libya were being shipped through Turkey to Syrian opposition groups. Whether this was actually happening remains disputed, but the possibility that the CIA annex was involved in covert weapons operations added layers of complexity to the security situation and to the political sensitivity of what happened there. The classified nature of the CIA facility created operational security challenges that may have contributed to the attack's success. The State Department personnel at the diplomatic compound weren't supposed to know all the details of what the CIA was doing. The CIA personnel couldn't fully coordinate security planning with State Department security because revealing too much about their operations would compromise operational security. This separation, necessary from an intelligence perspective, meant that security planning for the two facilities wasn't fully integrated. The local Libyan security forces providing protection for the diplomatic compound almost certainly didn't know about the CIA annex, or at least weren't supposed to know the details. But the extremist groups planning the attack apparently did know. They knew where it was, they knew Americans were there, and they attacked it after overrunning the diplomatic compound. This suggests intelligence penetration of American operations in Benghazi was deeper than realized. The attackers had information they shouldn't have had. The CIA personnel at the annex were better trained and better armed than the State Department security at the diplomatic compound. When the attack began, they were the only substantial American fighting force in Benghazi capable of responding. But they faced a dilemma. Their facility's location was classified, and moving toward the diplomatic compound in force would potentially reveal its location and purpose. The decision to respond, and the brief delay, while that decision was made and preparations were completed, became controversial, with some suggesting they were ordered to stand down, and others arguing they were simply preparing properly before moving into a combat situation. What's clear is that the dual nature of the American presence in Benghazi, the overt diplomatic facility and the covert CIA operation, created security and coordination challenges. If all American personnel had been in one properly secured facility with unified command and adequate defensive measures, the outcome might have been different. But operational security requirements, bureaucratic separation between state and CIA, and the desire to maintain both diplomatic and intelligence presences created a situation where neither facility was optimally secured or defended. The aftermath of the attack also revealed tensions between the agencies. The CIA wanted to protect information about their operations and were concerned that investigations would expose classified programs. The State Department was focused on their personnel who'd been killed and on understanding security failures at the diplomatic compound. These different priorities sometimes put the agencies at odds during investigations, with each protecting their own equities and interests rather than fully cooperating to understand what went wrong. While much attention focused on the 4 Americans who died, there were survivors, people who fought through the attack, witnessed the horror, lost friends, and carried physical and psychological scars long after. Their stories reveal details about the attack and its aftermath that official reports often miss. These were the people on the ground, making life or death decisions in real time, and their experiences matter. The security contractors at the CIA Annex, the men often referred to as the GRS team, Global Response Staff, were experienced former Special Operations personnel. When the attack on the diplomatic compound began, they heard the radio traffic and immediately prepared to respond. Some were already geared up and ready to move within minutes. Their accounts describe the tension of those early moments. Hearing that Americans were under attack, wanting to respond immediately, but needing to assess the situation and coordinate their response. When they finally moved toward the diplomatic compound, they drove through hostile territory, not knowing exactly what they were facing. The route was dangerous. They could have been ambushed. They could have arrived to find overwhelming enemy forces. They could have lost people before even reaching the compound. But they went anyway because that's what they were trained to do: protect Americans in danger regardless of personal risk. At the diplomatic compound, they found a chaotic scene. Buildings on fire, smoke everywhere, unclear where friendly forces were or where threats might be. They searched for survivors, came under fire, and had to make rapid decisions about whether to keep searching or withdraw before being trapped. The decision to withdraw without locating Ambassador Stevens haunted some of them. They knew someone was missing but couldn't find him in the smoke and chaos, and staying longer might have meant losing more people. Back at the CIA Annex, they prepared for what many correctly anticipated would be a follow-up attack. They set up defensive positions, checked ammunition, prepared casualty collection points. Some called family members, brief conversations that might be their last. They knew they were outnumbered, knew help wasn't coming soon, knew they might not survive the night, and they prepared to fight anyway. When the mortar attack came, it was terrifyingly accurate. The first rounds hit near defensive positions. The defenders moved, knowing mortars were deadly, and staying in one place meant death. But the follow-up rounds adjusted, tracking the movement. That's when Tyrone Woods and Glenn Doherty were killed, hit by mortars while defending their position. The survivors described the helplessness of being under accurate mortar fire with no way to suppress the enemy position effectively. One contractor was severely wounded, but survived. He was carried to cover by teammates while under fire, treated with limited medical supplies, and eventually evacuated when the situation stabilized. His recovery took months. The physical wounds healed, but the psychological impact of watching friends die, of fighting for hours thinking you might not survive, of being abandoned by the system that sent you there, those wounds took longer to heal, if they healed at all. The State Department personnel who survived, the diplomatic security agents and other staff who escaped the burning compound, also carried trauma they'd lost colleagues. They'd been under fire. They'd experienced the terror of being trapped in a burning building, not knowing if they'd escape. Some suffered from smoke inhalation. Others had burns or other injuries. All had psychological trauma from the experience. After the attack, survivors were quickly evacuated from Benghazi, but the experience didn't end there. They faced debriefings, investigations, medical evaluations. Some were told not to talk publicly about what they'd experienced, both for security reasons and to avoid complicating the political situation. They watched as the attack became a partisan political issue, as their experience was debated and reinterpreted by people who weren't there, as conspiracy theories flourished about what really happened. Several survivors eventually wrote books or gave interviews describing their experiences. These accounts reveal details that official reports had missed or downplayed. They described the confusion of that night, the communication failures, the sense of abandonment when no help arrived, the grief of losing friends. They also expressed frustration with how the attack was politicized, with both sides using their experience to make political points rather than focusing on the operational and intelligence failures that cost lives. Some survivors experienced survivor's guilt, the irrational but powerful feeling that they should have died with their friends or could have done something to save them. Some struggled with anger at the system that put them in that situation without adequate support. Some had difficulty readjusting to normal life after the intensity and trauma of that night. These aren't unique to Benghazi. They're common reactions to combat trauma, but they're part of the story that often gets lost in political debates about talking points and investigations. The CIA contractors who fought at the annex received some recognition, awards and commendations that often remain classified. But they couldn't talk publicly about their service because the CIA operations in Benghazi were classified. They saved lives, fought with courage, and carried wounds both visible and invisible. Yet they had to remain silent while others debated what happened and why. That silence was another form of sacrifice. The inability to tell your story, to defend your actions, to correct misrepresentations, because doing so would compromise classified operations. For these survivors, Benghazi wasn't a political issue or an intelligence case study. It was the worst night of their lives, a night when they fought and friends died, a night that would define them forever, whether they wanted it to or not. Their stories deserve to be part of how we understand what happened, because they were there. They know what it felt like, what decisions were made, and why, what it cost them personally. And their accounts, when they've been able to share them, reveal a truth that reports and investigations sometimes miss. That real people faced impossible situations, made difficult choices, and lived with the consequences while everyone else debated abstract questions about policy and procedure. More than a decade after the attack, Benghazi remains controversial and politically charged. But beyond the politics, it stands as a case study in intelligence failure, not because of a lack of resources or capability, but because of systemic problems in how information is collected, analyzed, shared, and acted upon. Benghazi shows what happens when threat assessment fails, when bureaucratic barriers prevent effective coordination, when security measures are inadequate for the threat environment, and when rapid response capability doesn't exist. It shows how multiple small failures can cascade into catastrophe. It shows how the gap between having information and acting on information can be measured in lives lost. It also shows the inherent difficulty of intelligence work in complex, chaotic environments. Libya in 2012 was unstable, unpredictable, and dangerous. Making accurate threat assessments in that environment was genuinely difficult. Providing adequate security while maintaining diplomatic engagement required accepting some level of risk. Not every threat can be prevented. Not every attack can be stopped. Intelligence agencies operate in a world of incomplete information, competing priorities, and impossible choices. But acknowledging the difficulty doesn't excuse the failures. People died in Benghazi who might have lived if different decisions had been made. The compound might have been better secured. The threat might have been taken more seriously. The response might have been faster. Those aren't certainties. Even with perfect intelligence and security, the attack might still have succeeded. But they're possibilities that haunt everyone involved. The Benghazi story isn't about conspiracy or cover-up. It's about systemic failure in a system that was supposed to protect Americans working in dangerous places. It's about warning signs that were visible but not heeded. It's about information that existed but wasn't effectively used. It's about decisions made or not made that had fatal consequences. And it's a reminder that intelligence work isn't abstract. It's about real people in real danger, whose lives depend on analysts correctly interpreting threats, decision-makers acting on warnings, and security measures actually working. When the system fails, people die. That's not hyperbole or exaggeration. That's just the reality of what happened in Benghazi on September 11th, 2012. The 4 Americans who died that night deserved better. They deserved intelligence systems that worked. They deserved security measures that were adequate. They deserved a rapid response when they came under attack. They deserved to come home. The fact that they didn't is the ultimate indictment of the failures that occurred. Everything else, the investigations, the political battles, the bureaucratic reforms, is secondary to that fundamental reality. 4 Americans went to work in Benghazi and never came home because the systems meant to protect them failed. That's what Benghazi really means. That's the lesson that should never be forgotten.